to another lecture in ANT 200, Introduction to Archaeology. In today's lecture, we will talk about the connections between drugs, healing arts, and spirituality in the context of ancient China and Egypt. To do so, we will draw on some archaeological evidence of medicinal practices, as well as ancient texts that describe medicinal recipes, herbs for healing, and collected knowledge about pharmacology. These texts are known as Materia, Medica, a Latin term used to describe medicinal texts from all over the pre-modern world. Any discussion of the role of mind-altering substances in ancient Chinese medicine must start with the legendary Shen Nong, a semi-mythical ruler who lived as far back as 2700 BC. Shen Nong, whose name literally translates as the divine farmer, is credited with teaching early Chinese populations about agriculture and healing. The laundry list of specific inventions attributed to Shen Nong is impressive. He supposedly invented the plow, irrigation, the axe and hoe, the Chinese calendar, the preservation of seeds, acupuncture, and moxibustion, which is the burning of mugwort on different parts of the body to heal them. Legend has it that prior to Shen Nong's rise to power, the people of prehistoric China were sick and starving. To put an end to their starvation, he taught them how to farm, using the tools he invented, the axe and hoe, as well as the plow. Then he went on developing medicine by wandering across the countryside, eating plants by the hundreds, at one point ingesting more than 70 poisons in a single day. All of this research led to the development of one of ancient China's most important books, Shen Nong's Classic of Herbal Medicine. Written around 200 CE, the Classic of Herbal Medicine records 365 different medications split into three big groups: harmless drugs with stimulating effects, therapeutic substances, and potentially dangerous drugs. Somewhat surprisingly, with Shen Nong's typology, cannabis is considered a harmless drug, while things like peaches, the fruit, are considered a strong, potentially dangerous drug. Shen Nong's Classic of Herbal Medicine provides several hundred medications, including medicines that use ingredients with hallucinogenic properties, like black henbane. He notes in his work that, quote, the seeds, when taken and properly prepared for a prolonged period, enable one to walk for long distances, benefiting to the mind and adding to the strength, and to communicate with spirits and seeing devils. When taken in excess, it causes one to stagger madly. As already noted, Shen Nong's Classic of Herbal Medicine also names cannabis as one of the fundamental herbs within his repertoire, and includes it in recipes for a variety of treatments. The text itself states Ma Fen, cannabis, is accurate and balanced. It mainly treats the 7 damages, disinhibits the 5 viscera, and precipitates the blood in cold qi. Taking much of it may make one behold ghosts and frenetically run about. Protracted talking may enable one to communicate with the spirit light and make the body light. Shen Nong's text indicates that black herbane and cannabis were used both for their medicinal qualities and for their psychoactive effects. As a quick note, the use of cannabis in a more concrete medicinal manner goes back to the 2nd century AD. The ancient Chinese surgeon Hua Tao was the first to use cannabis as an anesthetic for surgery, and the Chinese word for anesthesia turns out to very literally mean cannabis intoxication. And the word for cannabis itself, ma, was also used to indicate numbness. In order to understand the use of mind-altering substances like cannabis in Chinese medicine, it's necessary to grasp the philosophies that underpin traditional Chinese medicine itself. Since the publication of the Inner Canon of the Yellow Emperor more than 2,000 years ago, the concept of yin and yang have been at the core of traditional Chinese medicinal philosophy. The yin and yang are the opposite, complementary aspects of everything in the universe, from matter to energy to people. The yin is associated with the feminine, cold, dampness, downwardness, while the yang is associated with the masculine, heat, dryness, and upwardness. Equally as important as the yin and yang is the concept of qi, the vital energy that flows through everything. In the human body, it does this by following particular channels known as meridians. A lack of qi might manifest itself as a pale complexion or a lack of energy and strength. In addition to the yin, yang, and qi, Chinese medicine focuses on 5 elements or phases, each associated with a physical element: wood, water, fire, earth, and metal, as well as with an organ in the body: the liver, the kidney, the heart, the spleen, and the lungs. It's the interaction between these phases or elements that impacts the function or dysfunction of the body. Taoism became one of the earliest religions and philosophical beliefs to use the mind-altering power of cannabis to allow its priests to elevate their consciousness. The origins of Taoism go back to the ancient Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu, who lived in the middle of the first millennium BCE. In his early days, Lao Tzu worked in the imperial court. But day after day, he became increasingly frustrated that the royal family would not follow the path of natural goodness. And so, at the ripe age of 80 years old, he left the court and headed west, eventually to the land of modern Tibet. Upon finally reaching Tibet, Lao Tzu encountered a young soldier who asked him to write down his teachings. And so he did. And what became known as the Tao Te Ching, the way and its power. At the core of Taoism and Lao Tzu's teaching is the Tao itself, which might be translated as the way. The main goal of the way is to become one with nature. Because Taoism's goal is to become one with nature and to move smoothly and impulsively through it, Taoism is also tightly linked to the concept of yin and yang. The goal is to ensure that the yin and the yang are in perfect balance in order to become one with Tao. The concept of yin and yang were applied to cannabis, which has both feminine and masculine strains. As it turns out, the feminine strain is more powerful and was thus more heavily cultivated. Afterwards, it was used to treat diseases that were thought to have come from the absence of yin, for example, gout, constipation, and absent-mindedness. There is a substantial debate about exactly how far back in time the use of cannabis goes within Taoist religion and philosophy. We know for sure that the burning of cannabis was employed by the 6th century CE as part of the purification process involved in Taoist liturgy. This reference comes from the Wushang Baiyao, a sort of Taoist encyclopedia that translates as the Supreme Secret Essentials, essentially a refashioning of Taoism connected to the imperial state. Other references in the Wushang Baiyao suggest that cannabis use went back much further even within Taoism itself. It says, for example, that hallucinogenic smoke was used in the burning of incense for purification, long before this text was composed. Was it referring to cannabis? It's certainly a possibility, but there's no real way to know for sure. Other possible early references include the 4th century CE records of the Assemblies of the Perfect Immortals, written by Zhi Hong. In this text, the author states that, quote, "For those who begin practicing the Tao, it is not necessary to go into the mountains. Some with purifying incense and sprinkling and sweeping are also able to call down the perfected immortals." The followers of the Lady Wai and the Shu are of this kind. The Lady Wai, referenced in this passage, was the founder of Shanqing School of Taoism. A 5th century CE text states that in this school, hemp seeds were used by early magicians to give one preternatural knowledge of the future. The use of hemp seed may be supported by recent archaeological finds dating back to 500 BC. The Jerzanko Cemetery in Western China has yielded burials with incense burners that contained cannabis residues, indicating that Taoists may have been using cannabis back some 2 millennia ago. But the Taoist connection to cannabis doesn't stop there. One of the legendary Taoist immortals is known as Magu, literally the hemp maiden. Her name comes from the name for hemp, the fiber of the cannabis plant, ma, which is depicted with the ideograph of 2 plants drying in a shed, and the word gu, which can mean maiden or a female priestess. Magu's story is known throughout ancient China, Korea, and even Japan. In these stories, she's depicted as a beautiful young woman who grew up in the 6th century CE, a poor young girl working in the textile industry. The story of Magu and the peach solidifies her role as a healer of the sick and a helper of the poor. According to this story, on her way home from work, Magu saw an old lady even poorer than herself and gives her a peach. She goes home to make the old lady some porridge, but is unable to deliver it because her mean old dad locks her in a room. Kind of similar to a Cinderella-like story here. She finally escapes and goes to find the old lady, but all that's left is the pit of the peach. Magu plants the pit, which becomes an incredibly prolific peach tree. She proceeds to give peaches out to the poor who can't afford any other food. Soon, they are said to have magical healing qualities. While most Chinese authors have depicted Magu's magical elixir of life in the form of the peach, Magu herself is closely tied to cannabis. Not only does her name indicate her role as the hemp maiden, but the location of her sanctuary suggests the connection as well. Magu served as the goddess of Mount Tai, a sacred mountain in the Shandong region, one of the heaviest hemp-growing areas in all of modern China. Okay, so now that we've learned a little bit about the connection between drugs like cannabis and ancient Chinese religious and medicinal practices, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about Egypt. Our most concrete evidence for the use of drugs in ancient Egypt comes from the realm of medicine. Now, the way medicine was practiced in ancient Egypt resembled the way that medicine was practiced in much of the pre-modern world. It was a combination of science and religion. This combination is perhaps best captured in the process we all know as mummification. Our evidence of medicine in ancient Egypt comes from a wide variety of sources. Wall paintings in tombs and temples, the archaeological remains of medicinal instruments like those depicted behind me, written accounts in historical and literary texts, and the well-preserved biological remains of Egyptian mummies. Egyptian doctors were often part of the priesthood and trained within a temple where medicinal texts were kept and copied for future generations. Within these texts, we see a wide variety of levels within medicine. You could be a physician, an overseer of physicians, a palace physician, or an inspector of physicians. And we see specialization as well, with some being ophthalmologists, others focusing on internal disease, and still others focusing on dentistry, much like doctors do today. Closely linked to this medicinal infrastructure were the gods of Egypt. The hawk god Horus was known as the divine physician, while Thoth was the god of healing and science. The warrior lioness Sekhmet, in addition to being a prominent part of beer mythology in Egypt, served as the goddess of disease. And even Imhotep, the architect of the first ever pyramid, was later deified and became somewhat of a healing saint. So if you were going under the knife for surgery in ancient Egypt, it was important to be good to the gods and to make sure you got a good physician. The most specific details of how people were treated come from a series of papyri, an ancient form of paper made from the stalks of reeds. This is actually where we get the English word paper from. These papyri contain information about both diagnoses and treatments for diseases. The most famous of these is known as the Smith Surgical Papyrus, named for an American adventurer, Edwin Smith, who bought the papyrus in Egypt in 1862. This papyrus discusses diseases and how likely it is that a person will survive them. Most of the treatments are physical or mechanical. For example, bandage the arm, put a splint on the leg, just stay in bed for a few more days. But some recommend specific material treatments like honey and copper salt for open wounds. Somewhat amazingly, these substances have actually been shown to reduce bacterial infection in modern scientific experiments. An example of a treatable injury from the papyrus is as follows. If you examine a man having a break in his upper arm and you find his upper arm hanging down, separated from its joints, you should say, "You have a break in your upper arm, an ailment which I will treat." You should place him on his back, with something folded between his two shoulder blades. You should spread out his shoulders in order to stretch apart his upper arm until the break falls into place. You should make for him 2 splints of linen and apply one of them to the inside of his arm and the other of them to the underside of his arm. You should bind it with yarn and treat afterwards with honey every day until he recovers. The same scribe who copied the Smith papyrus also copied another one that became known as the Ebers papyrus. Originally purchased by the same Edwin Smith I just discussed and sold to Egyptologist George Ebers 10 years later, the Ebers papyrus suggests a series of herbal, plant, and drug-like treatments for internal disease and wounds. Acacia, for example, could be used to ease diarrhea, and aloe vera, just like today, was used to treat burns. Juniper could be used to soothe cramping, and garlic could help with your flatulence. That boundary between common plant and psychoactive drug changes when we get to the poppy plant. The poppy plant is the source of the drug opium, which can then be refined into morphine. The poppy plant from which opium is derived is known by the Latin term Papaver somniferum, quite literally the poppy that brings sleep. In addition to being a sedative, opium works as a pain reducer as well. The active ingredient in the poppy flower, the part used to make opium, comes from the unripe bulb, which looks similar to a pomegranate. This bulb or capsule is then carefully sliced open, and the goo that starts oozing out, officially known as the latex, is what constitutes opium. In fact, the whole word opium is derived from the Greek word opus, which means vegetable juice. Raw opium contains a number of alkaloids, which are special chemicals with profound effects. The most prevalent of these alkaloids within raw opium is morphine, which suppresses pain and brings sleep. As with the Latin name for the plant, morphine also makes etymological sense. It is named after the Greek god Morpheus, the god of dreams. The poppy flower was grown over large swaths of Eurasia, from Greece and Turkey in the west to China and India in the east. Written records of its use go back about 5,000 years ago, where it was documented in Sumerian cuneiform tablets. While the poppy flower wasn't indigenous to Egypt, the Ebers papyrus, as well as archaeological depictions and botanical remains, all suggest that the poppy was indeed used in ancient Egypt for psychoactive purposes, especially in magic and medicine. Specifically, the Ebers papyrus mentions something known as shepen as part of the remedy for a crying child. As treatment goes as follows. A remedy for too much crying in a child, use sephen seeds, fly dung from the walls, is made and fly dung from the walls is made to a paste, mixed with water, strained, drunk for 4 days. The crying will cease immediately. This certainly sounds like the seeds of a poppy flower with its pain-killing and sleep-inducing properties. In addition to the Ebers papyrus, we have archaeological evidence for actual morphine as well. The tomb of Ka, dating to the New Kingdom and located at Deir el Medina, a site famous for being the settlement that housed the workers who built the Valley of the Kings, yielded a small stone vessel. Inside that vessel was an oily substance, which chemical analyses confirmed contained morphine. Amazingly, the morphine hadn't lost its potency, and when it was tested on a frog and mouse, it put them to sleep. And when placed under the skin of another frog, it actually killed it. We also have iconographic evidence of the presence of poppies in ancient Egypt. At the tomb of Senedjem, we have clear depictions of a group of red poppies among several other plants and flowers. Elaborate gold earrings from the tomb of Queen Tezzeret, dating to the 19th dynasty of the New Kingdom, also depict poppies. A dynasty later, the famous pharaoh Tutankhamun was buried with dried poppies as part of his embalming cache. Finally, the stela of a woman named Teperet, showing a devotional offering scene, appears to show a budding poppy flower about to burst open in the bottom left-hand corner of the scene. The other plant that frequently is depicted in Egyptian art and literature, and which had psychoactive properties, is the blue lotus. Known by the Latin name Nymphaeum caerulea, the blue lotus was a type of lily that opened with bright colors during the day and then closed again by mid-morning. Because of their prevalence in the Nile Valley, the blue lotus became one of the main symbols of Upper Egypt. The bright blue bloom of the lotus flower with the yellow center mimicked the daily rise of the sun in the blue Egyptian sky, a botanical metaphor for the cyclical nature of the cosmos. Just like with the poppy, Eber's Papyrus is one of the best historical sources for the blue lotus in Egypt. Here we see it categorized more as a poison than a medicine, however. And just like with the poppy, the blue lotus contains alkaloids, which in large quantities are quite dangerous. Our evidence for what the Egyptians were actually doing with the blue lotus is far less robust than our evidence for the poppy. Outside of the Eber's Papyrus, most of our evidence for use of the blue lotus comes from wall paintings in tombs and temples. Starting in the New Kingdom, we get increasingly frequent depictions of banqueting scenes where blue lotuses are present. We see women harvesting the flowers, draping them over wine jugs, extracting liquid from them in cold presses. And we even see other scenes in which women pour small vials of unidentified liquid into large wine bowls. The suggestion would then be that the extract from the blue lotus was combined with wine to add a further psychoactive effect to the drinking of wine at banquets, festivals, and religious rituals. In total, the Eber's Papyrus mentions more than 60 herbs and plants that could be used to heal the sick from their ailments. The poppy and the blue lotus are simply the most psychoactive of those included. We saw earlier how things like honey or aloe vera could also produce useful effects, even if they didn't have the same dramatic effect on the mind as narcotic-producing plants like cannabis. Finally, we come to the famous cocaine mummies of ancient Egypt. In 1992, Svetlana Bablonova, a toxicologist from Germany, published that she had found trace evidence of cocaine, hashish, and nicotine in hair samples from an ancient Egyptian mummy dating to around 1000 BC. The trace amounts of cocaine are particularly intriguing because the coca plant is indigenous to South America. These findings suggest that there may have been pre-Columbian contact between South America and Africa. However, when a different team of scientists attempted to retest the trace chemical elements of the mummy's hair, only traces of nicotine were found. Interestingly, nicotine is also from a New World plant, tobacco. On the surface, this might be the conclusion, but a further possible explanation must be mentioned. several plants other than tobacco can actually produce the alkaloid nicotine. And two of these, Withania somnifera and Apium graveolens, are known to have been used by ancient Egyptians. As we saw with the poppy and the blue lotus, the ancient Egyptians weren't particularly shy about using their drugs. It tended to be for medicinal or ritual purposes, and they were happy to portray it in text, art, and artifacts. No such representations of the coca plant or the tobacco plant exist, which suggests we should perhaps look for another explanation for Babylonova's initial cocaine mummy results. In our next lecture, we will continue this discussion of drugs in medicine and ritual, focusing in on cocaine use in South America.